think this is a first on Young Heretics. To my knowledge, this will be the first time on the show that I have ever reviewed a Pixar movie. So I went to see Inside Out 2 over the weekend. And I went because it's making a huge splash at the box office. Kind of unexpectedly. Pixar's not known for great sequels, but the first one of these movies, Inside Out 1, was one of its biggest successes ever. Huge sensation. I went and saw it in the theater when it came out and was shocked at how much I liked it. Really surprised. I expected to be kind of grumpy about it because this is a movie, if you're not familiar, very high concept kids movie about a young girl named Riley who's 11 years old, and inside of her mind or her brain or her soul, or it's never quite clear, she has these 5 personified emotions: joy, anger, sadness, fear, and disgust. And they're kind of the primary colors of her experience of the world, clearly borrowed from a range of psychotherapeutic ideas about how kids develop. And the story of the movie is about kind of Riley's inner life as described in metaphor via these personified emotions. The great task is to integrate sadness into the crew because Riley's had this mostly happy life, but now she's moving across the country and she's very sad, but Joy doesn't want to allow that to happen. And so it's this sort of sweet story about learning to understand and accept your sadness as an honest part of your experience and to integrate it into your whole consciousness. And I went back and rewatched this movie when the second one started to make a splash because I remembered kind of liking it, but I also had this association in my head with my least favorite modern idea about humanity, which is that we're basically a product of these momentary impulses and whims. And if you add up the big machine of our neurochemical impulses, what you get is the self. The self is just a collection of random firings or responses to stimuli or what have you. And what I remembered about the movie when I watched it again is that's actually not at all what it depicts. Now, let me say at the outset of this description of the movie that no metaphor for the soul works all the way down. If you press too hard on any metaphor for the soul, it's gonna start to fall apart. And this is something that Plato says in the Phaedrus, actually, one of his dialogues about this subject, where he has this famous image of the soul as a charioteer pulled along by these 2 horses, kind of a good horse and a bad horse, maybe reason and desire, but it's left purposefully vague because Plato has Socrates say, to really describe the essence of the soul would be the matter not just of a long diegesis, a long telling or description of things, but a divine one. That is, it's only God who can sort of see the soul in its absolute form. We, because we are souls, because every word we speak comes out of a soul, can only talk obliquely in metaphors. And so Plato gives himself a little bit of leeway and a little bit of grace on that. And I think we should give modern versions of this sort of soul description leeway and grace. And this goes for therapeutic ideas about the soul. It goes for pop culture ideas about the soul. Just because we are using language and imagery to describe the soul that isn't exactly precise doesn't mean we're necessarily going to get it wrong. That's not my problem with a lot of modern soul discourse or psychology discourse. My problem with modernity in this respect is more that we don't tend to make room for the idea that we might be whole conscious entities that have different aspects to us, but ultimately have free will, have sovereignty over our choices, and have a self-awareness that is more than just the sum of its neurochemical parts. And so I was kind of wary going into Inside Out both times I watched it, being like, is that what this movie is about? But that's actually not what the movie is about. And the movie is much more canny and self-aware, and indeed even a little mysterious about the nature of this creature, this being called Riley, who is a whole entity and doesn't just boil down to whatever emotion she happens to be having at the moment. And all of this has kind of confirmed me in my theory about psychology and psychotherapy and the universality that we now seem to be experiencing, where everyone talks in these psychotherapeutic terms, using therapy speak. And my hot take on this is that this is what we talk about instead of talking about the soul, because for a variety of reasons that I'm going to get into, soul talk, the use of the language of the soul, has fallen out of fashion, started to feel cringe. People don't feel comfortable talking in spiritual terms. And just like we took all of our pagan worship impulses and like Mother Nature and all of our ideas about the spirits in the world, and we relocated them into physical science, we took all of our impulses to talk about the soul, our idea of ourselves as spiritual entities, and we relocated them into psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And so now when we say things like, I'm working through trauma, or I'm dealing with my inner child, or I'm trying even to interpret my dreams, all of this stuff is just a modern, kind of updated language for talking about the same things we used to talk about by saying, verily my soul is troubled, or I am having a moment of spiritual desolation, or this other set of terms that we used to use when we were more confident and comfortable talking about the soul. So I think that's what we're dealing with when we look at a movie like Inside Out, just like when we talk to one another in this kind of therapy language. And insofar as that goes, Inside Out 1 was a pretty good language for talking about the way that we experience the world. Riley's emotions aren't everything to her. She has a whole architecture inside of her, some of which she understands, some of which is mysterious and opaque. There's unconscious regions, but then there's also kind of a structure of logic that shapes the whole thing. And Riley herself is sort of the governing consciousness that incorporates all of these elements, and becoming more herself means finding a place for each of these elements. And so in this respect, in the sense that there might be multiple parts of us, it bears some resemblance to the classical idea that we get from Plato, where Plato also observes that we contain multitudes, as it were, that there are multiple parts of us inside of us. The very fact that you can talk to yourself about things kind of reveals this mysterious aspect of us, that when I say to myself, don't eat that cake or whatever, who's talking to whom, and which one of us is me? And Plato kind of goes around this concept throughout his career and ends up circling around this idea that there is something in you that is most essentially you. Maybe it's your rational mind, maybe it's the part of you that kind of gathers everything together, but in the end, your desires, your momentary impulses, your emotions, the subroutines that your mind goes through, these are part of the material of you, but they're taken alone, they wouldn't really make up a human being. And so you need a final word within your mind that really is the self, that sort of organizes and governs all these other things. And Inside Out 2 doesn't quite get there, but it does sort of move interestingly in that direction. And so I went to see this second movie, and look, it's a sequel. It definitely is not as mind-blowing as the original, if the original was mind-blowing, or at least interesting and new. This is basically the same script, but applied to puberty. And puberty is represented as a reconfiguration of the way that the soul is structured, or the inner life or the mind is structured, and also an addition of a bunch of new emotions, which are kind of more complex and difficult to manage. And crucially, most importantly, the emotion that comes in and really takes over is anxiety. And what I want to talk about today specifically is anxiety, not just in this movie, Inside Out 2, but as a concept in therapy and in the therapy speak we all use to talk to each other, and to try and get at just what anxiety really is. Because I had a fascinating question from a listener, Dan LaVenture, who objects to the concept of anxiety in that he doesn't think it actually helps us to understand more precisely or more clearly the contours of our inner life, but that anxiety is really just an element of what the classical theory of emotions, what I've identified as fear. And that when we talk about anxiety as if it were something separate from fear, we're starting to pathologize our emotions in this very therapeutic way, in much the same way that we might talk about depression when what we really mean is sorrow or sadness or desolation. And these more clinical terms like depression and anxiety run the risk of turning the normal structure of the inner life and the spiritual contours of our experience into just a series of diseases and neurochemical impulses to be medicated away. And once you've started pathologizing things, then maybe you've started reaching for drugs and medication and all that stuff. And so Dan asks me, I think very interestingly, whether anxiety in its therapeutic sense as a kind of intruder into our lives that takes over our emotions and our experience, whether anxiety is an allegregore, which is this term that I've been using for things that we think are allegorical in modern scientific language, but actually are just ways of getting at, spiritual concepts that we don't have any other language for. And if anxiety is an allegregore, I think what anxiety really is would be a demon, right? It would be a form of demonic possession. And there are moments in Inside Out 2 where anxiety sort of looks that way, although the movie doesn't ultimately end up pathologizing anxiety and saying that anxiety needs to be kicked out. Anxiety does take control of Riley for a lot of the movie and acts like this sort of invading foreign entity that takes over her mind. And so the question here is a much bigger question about whether therapy is equipped to deal with the things that demonology used to deal with. Because in the ancient world, when we were taken over by a foreign force in our minds, or when we felt that we had lost control, we would often describe this as demonic possession. And this now sounds kind of outdated. Maybe it even sounds medieval, or in the worst sense of that term, it sounds kind of regressive and superstitious. But actually, talking about demon possession is weirdly a very compassionate way to deal with people who are struggling with these sorts of issues, because it says you are not consigned to this problem. God didn't make you this way. This isn't just a feature of your inner soul structure. This is something foreign that is invading you and that can be resisted, that can be maybe cast out. And the question that therapy has to face and grapple with is whether it has the resources that demonology had for distinguishing between the individual, the self, the whole person, and whatever disease or problem or psychosis or even just compulsion that person is dealing with. And this is what we talk about when we talk about pathologization, right? We say, oh, you've pathologized a normal emotion, or we say, yes, there is a sort of psychological pathology going on here that we want to get rid of. And in demonology, there's very clear, cut-to-the-bone kind of language for describing that. There's the person, which is the soul, which has maybe multiple parts within it, and then there's this foreign invader called the demon. But in psychotherapy, in psychoanalysis, since there's no such thing as spirits or foreign entities or whatever, it becomes kind of hard to draw a clean-cut distinction between the individual, the person, and the other or the outsider that has invaded. And instead, you have to end up saying, well, this is just part of you that's gone haywire, or maybe this is actually an unrecognized good within you that needs to be integrated. Inside Out 2 and Inside Out 1 both tend to talk about these things as if we actually just need to find a way of accepting and loving all the different parts of ourselves. But what if there's a part of you that isn't acceptable, that is simply evil, that wants to murder children in their sleep or whatever? And we do experience in some extremes of our human life this uncanny extreme where we do find that we want to fight against some part of ourselves or dissociate ourselves from it. And what can demonology do in that respect, and what can psychology do in that respect, is this fascinating question that's kind of raised by ideas like anxiety, when we start to talk about our anxiety or our depression as these foreign intruders. what can we do about this? Well, here's an interesting way to start answering this question, I think. Why did therapy happen? Why did Freud come along? Why is there such a thing as psychoanalysis? Was it because somewhere in the 19th century, people's experience of life just became radically different? So for most of human history, we were having one set of experiences of the world. We were having one set of emotions, one set of reactions to things. And then somewhere in the modern era, after the advent of science, our experience of the world became completely different. Well, maybe, perhaps in some capacities, we did start to experience the world differently as we learned more about science and the physical world. But ultimately, I don't really think that's what happened that gave rise to psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. I think that we were having basically the same set of experiences of the world as we had always had. Joy, fear, sadness, anger, right? These are not words that would have been foreign to Plato or Aristotle or the Church Fathers. The concepts that we deal with at a primary level, or the experiences, let's say, that we're describing at a primary level, haven't changed in the era of therapy speak or psychoanalysis. What has changed is what you would call the causative account of how these things come about. The explanation we give for what's going on beneath the surface of our direct conscious experience has radically transformed. And I think that's because we stopped feeling comfortable explaining our experiences with reference to supernatural entities, consciousnesses that transcend our own in the world, things like angels, demons, God, and even the soul, which had kind of been misunderstood and maligned as this fairy tale about a ghost in the machine. And as science gradually advanced and we learned just how much of the world we're able to describe in terms of physical cause and effect, those sorts of explanations started to feel a little dicey. We got kind of skittish about using them. And so instead we developed a whole set of other explanations that follow this pattern of cause and effect, of history, right? We started attributing the experiences we have, the problems we face, and even the disorders we suffer from, not in terms of our soul, other souls, and entities like angels and demons, but in terms of a range of kind of causes that come from within the world. So those causes can include our neurochemical impulses, of course. You can find branches of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis that involve attributing things like depression to chemical imbalance in the brain. But that's not the only natural cause you could give. You could also tell a story about your childhood and how things that your parents said to you have influenced the patterns that you tend to exhibit in your thoughts. Or you could talk about your genes, your genetics, your longer history in terms of race and family and all of that. You could talk about evolution. You can talk about any number of underlying phenomena that have kind of a natural cause, a cause within the world. And it turns out that that actually does get you some insight, get you some advances. It's not like that's a totally useless way of looking at things. And it can help you to account for a number of things that are also present in ancient psychology, in the ancient study of the soul. And Inside Out 1 would be a good example of this, right? It gives this little portrait of the emotions, but also the architecture of the soul that, by and large, I'm not sure Plato would have been completely upset about this, or Aristotle. It's probably not, it doesn't use the same language that they would have used, but the idea that we have multiple different elements within us, that none of them is actually a foreign spirit or a god or whatever, but is actually just part of us within our inner lives that needs integrating into this one coherent whole. That does kind of jive, and there are elements of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy that can help us account for all sorts of things that have arisen in our past, all sorts of wounds that we have suffered. But what psychotherapy doesn't do, what it's not even really trying to do or to answer, is it doesn't give a definite ontological account of the entities or the experiences that it describes, unless you're just a pure materialist. And there are some of these, right, who will say, yeah, this is all just chemicals firing and cause and effect, and what we need to do is reconfigure, either through drugs or through talk therapy or through whatever. We just need to reconfigure the physical patterns that are going on here. But most therapists that I know, that I talk to, are not that reductive. They think that there is more to consciousness than just matter moving around. And usually, most forms of therapy will remain kind of agnostic about what these entities really even are that we're dealing with when we talk about sadness, when we talk about our inner lives, when we talk about emotion, and so on and so forth. And we give these explanations that come from personal history, but we don't say what the ancients used to say, which is that, yes, and these are, so this is the soul. It has these parts. Or this is a demon. It acts this way. And so when you look at ancient descriptions, say, of demonic possession, one of the famous things that has been observed is that sometimes they sound a lot like descriptions of people suffering from what we would now call mental illness. Not always, not in every case, but often you'll say, one common way of putting this is, we used to have an epidemic of demonic possession and no mental illness. Now we have epidemics of mental illness and no demonic possession. And maybe you'll say, well, yeah, there used to be one set of experiences, now there's another. But I would say, yeah, the same set of experiences is now being described, captured, organized according to a different set of causal accounts. And with all Allegregores, the question is, which language is nearer to reality, is most clear and full and precise and simple for describing what's going on. And so take a movie like Inside Out 2, which represents anxiety as this sort of rogue force within the mind that needs to be tamed and domesticated and incorporated, but not necessarily exiled, unless it becomes truly pathological and runs utterly haywire and something goes wrong, right? The movie sort of refers to a widespread therapeutic idea that the difference between anxiety and fear is that fear is a response to present or perceived threats, whereas anxiety is defined as your imagined projection of future threats and your response to things that might happen or could happen, and how realistic your description of those things are. And so what we're really talking about here is a set of patterns in the mind, in both cases. In the case of what this movie and some schools of thought in therapy just define as fear versus what this movie defines as anxiety. And kind of the underlying thesis, I would say, is that anxiety is a pattern of thoughts that can go haywire or run as this sort of uncontrollable script unless it's counterbalanced by these other forces, ideas, thoughts that you ultimately have to regain control over. You, the self, have to become kind of sovereign over all these different entities that are acting within you. And the question that the movie raises but doesn't answer, that we are now, I think, grappling with in our talk about pathologizing anxiety, is whether you yourself are always able to take control of this entity and incorporate it into yourself, or whether sometimes what we call anxiety actually has a being outside of you that doesn't belong within you and that needs to be exiled or cast out. And so by comparison to this way of looking at things in this set of questions, I want to read now a passage from the Gospel of Mark, which is very famous. It's chapter 5 in Mark. And it's one version of the story of the Gerasene demoniac. Gerasene is, Gadarene or Gerasene is one location near the Sea of Galilee where Jesus goes and casts a demon out of somebody. And if there's a description in the Gospels that most nearly matches what we think of when we talk about demonic possession and mental illness, this is the description that sounds most like mental illness. Here it is. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him any more, not even with a chain. For he had often been chained, hand and foot, but he tore his chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. It's that last sentence, cry out and cut himself with stones, that really starts to feel like things that we might have encountered in people who are really suffering from a breakdown, from a mental illness. And the reason that this passage raises all the questions that we're talking about is because in this story, Jesus ends up casting a demon out of this person. And what's really interesting in the Greek is that one way he ends up doing this is by drawing a distinction that doesn't previously exist between the human being that he's talking to and this foreign entity. So when we start out, we learn of a man with an impure spirit, which is to say, the demonized one. In some sense, he's defined by this pattern of behavior, that he harms himself, that he is separated from society, that he can't be constrained, that he has this unruly nature. But when Jesus comes, one thing that happens is the impure spirits drive him to run toward him and say, "What do you want with me?" So he's sort of attracted to Jesus, but also says, "Go away," essentially. Come out of, in God's name, don't torture me. So there's like an inner conflict going on where he's attracted to Jesus, but also seems to have something in him that's hostile. And then the first thing that Jesus says is, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." So a couple lines earlier, we've had the impure spirit man, which is that he's totally defined by this pattern of behavior. And Jesus looks at the man, and by looking at him, reframes the situation to say, no, there is the man, and then there is the impure spirit. Come out of him, impure spirit. So even in the Greek of the gospel, there is this idea that part of the cure here is to identify an entity other than the patient, that there should be something in there that isn't original to him, that needs to be cast out, because the man himself was created pure and does not have this natural. It's not natural to human beings to be trapped by these destroying or debilitating forces. And so the demonology approach to this begins from the premise that at least in some cases, not in all, it's not like every bad thought that you have is a demon necessarily, but at least in some cases, the ancient idea of demonology is that some of these entities within your soul are not you. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And part of the cure involves identifying which ones are you and which ones are not. This is particularly interesting when we fast forward again to modern therapy and take a particular look at a kind of therapy that has recently gained a lot of currency, which is called internal family systems. And internal family systems is basically the idea of soul parts. It's got some difference to it, but it's basically a modern psychotherapeutic way of talking about what Plato was talking about in the Republic when he said, look at how you talk to yourself. There are multiple elements within you that need to be arranged, understood, incorporated, all of these things. And IFS, as it's called, internal family systems, not only visualizes the self as comprised of multiple different parts, but actually works in therapy with these multiple different elements. And so you might go into a kind of conversation in therapy with, say, the part of you that is trying to sabotage your relationships. And in that conversation, you might actually learn from this other entity within you, let's say the relationship sabotager part. Just like in the movie Inside Out, where there's this metaphor of the joy within you and the sadness within you. In IFS, we talk at least as if there are these other entities. And I'm going to read now a review by Scott Alexander, who's a very prolific and well-known blogger who used to write a blog called Slate Star Codex and who now writes a Substack called Astral Codex 10. I'll drop the link here. And it's a review of a book by Robert Falconer, who's one of the internal family systems people out there, called The Others Within Us, about this tension in internal family systems that sometimes you come up against an entity that doesn't present as being from within naturally part of the soul. But first, here's just Scott Alexander's description, which I think is pretty good, of how internal family systems tends to operate. He writes, IFS is about working with parts. You treat your mind as containing a self, a sort of perfect angelic intellect without any flaws or mental illnesses, and various parts, little sub-minds with their own agendas who can sometimes occlude or overwhelm the self. And I think that might be a slightly dismissive way of describing it, because just as in Platonic psychology, in internal family systems, it's not that the self is necessarily totally separate from all these other entities. It's just that it's sovereign over them and needs to have governing control. And these other parts are also part of you, but need to be integrated under the control, or under at least the benevolent tutelage of the self, the rational mind, whatever. During therapy, you talk to the parts, learn their motives, and bargain with them. For example, you might identify a part of you that wants to sabotage your relationships. You will visualize it and name it. Maybe you call her Sabby, and she looks like a snake. You talk to Sabby and learn that after your first breakup, when you decided you never wanted to feel that level of pain again, you unconsciously created her and ordered her to make sure you never got close enough to anyone else to get hurt. So here we're talking about a pattern of behavior, let's say sabotaging your relationships, that is identified now with a kind of current in the ocean of your mind. That maybe the current isn't totally distinct from the ocean, but we can nevertheless talk about it as a thing. We use the word current because there's such a thing as a current. If you picture a big lake or an ocean and you say that current there is moving this way, that's the sort of talk that we engage in when we talk about parts of the soul. And IFS and Platonic psychology and any number of other ways of dealing with this talks about these entities as genuinely real, and it is pretty serious about, the currents in the ocean are real and can be redirected or reoriented or even totally dissipated, right? So that's kind of how IFS works. But then the really interesting thing here is that eventually, in Falconer's book, he starts to run up against parts of the soul that resist integration into the whole, that resist being totally owned by or satisfied by some natural place. Because you might say to the part of yourself that's trying to keep you safe, okay, tell me about the red flags in a relationship, but you're no longer going to be in charge. So let's say that Sabby, the part of you that observes red flags, is always criticizing whoever you go on a date with. And that's maybe useful if you want to notice things that you might otherwise ignore because you're besotted and flirtatious and falling in love, right? But Sabby shouldn't be the only voice in charge. You should be able to listen to her and then change things. This is, again, what happens in Inside Out as well, to emotions like anxiety. But here's what happens when things go wrong. The IFS community was a bunch of normal, respectable therapists trying to practice normal therapy, but every so often, one of their patients' parts would admit, unprompted, to being a demon, or in the words of one such entity, "No, I'm not a part of her. I'm a much more powerful and beautiful being, and I'm going to crush her like a worm, the same way I'm going to crush you." If the story about Sabby is a typical IFS session, here's an atypical one. Another patient comes to you, once again asking for help because they're sabotaging their relationship. You ask them to go into a trance and find a part of them involved. They meet a dragon called Damien. So far, so good. You ask Damien why he's sabotaging the patient's relationships, expecting to hear a beautiful story about how the patient's mother was a doormat, and this made the patient unconsciously charge a part of herself with protecting her own independence or something. Instead, Damien says he's sabotaging them because, and I'm going to edit the language here, F you, right? Screw you, essentially. This is very eerie and very uncanny, and it challenges, I think, the whole premise of psychotherapy as a secular discipline, which was designed essentially to account for everything that we experience and think, the whole range and wealth of human emotions and subtleties and consciousness and conscious experience from within the logic and the structure of nature, which is the logic of cause and effect. And once there's a foreign entity, once there's a soul or a consciousness beyond and above our own, there's a new source of causes in that pattern, right? If nature is this internally consistent, closed system of cause and effect, angels and demons and God are outside forces that can disturb that pattern of cause and effect. And so the whole premise of therapy, which is that we're trying basically to just set the cause and effect pattern into right order, right alignment, is troubled by the idea that there might be parts of you or things within you that don't ultimately belong there. Demonology, the spiritual realm, the spiritual attitude, is very, very comfortable dealing with these sorts of ideas. In fact, it's set up to describe the world as if that were a central part of it. Again, it's not as if every possible psychological problem in the ancient world would have been attributed to demons, but the ancient world has room for the idea of an entity that is a foreign intruder into the conscious mind. Can such entities exist? What would it mean for them to exist? This is the question that we're wrestling with and coming up against, and this is why the whole concept of Allegregore is really interesting to me, because when you start talking about Mother Nature as if she were real, the question becomes, is she real? Is it possible for her to be real? What would it mean for her to be real? Well, let's go back to this image of the current in the ocean, right? In an ocean, we have multiple different currents, and we can point to them, and they are things that we, at least, can think about and know about, but we think of them still as parts of the ocean. The ocean is also a thing, and no current exists outside of some body of water like an ocean. There's no such thing as a current, unless you start, generalizing it and talking about currents in the wind or whatever. Let's say there's no current outside of some fluid body. And so the fluid body is something we're very comfortable talking about because it's an object, it's a physical thing. And this is the realm that science has really made us able to think about, to understand, to rationalize according to cause and effect. But the current has a sort of uncertain ontological status in that materialist worldview, in that scientific worldview. In other words, we're not totally sure what kind of existence it has, because we want certainly to be able to talk about it, identify it, but we also kind of want, or we instinctively feel the impulse to boil it down to just a bunch of objects moving in a certain pattern. And yet the pattern itself also has a kind of existence, and as we embark on things like therapy, we find that speaking of the patterns as if they had their own entity, their own existence, their own being, starts to become at least very, very convenient, even if we don't think it gets to the heart of things or to the bedrock of reality. And then we have to deal with this question: is the current real? Are the parts of us real? Are our soul parts real, even though they only exist as patterns or currents or modes of flow, types of behavior within this ultimately real entity? And the way of talking about this in ancient philosophy, if you're interested, would be to talk about archai, or to talk about substrates, things that have actual primary existence, primary entity, and then to talk about things that are accidents of or features of those entities. And what's the ontological status of things that can only exist within? So, for example, the quality of being green, right? There's no such thing as just green on its own without a green object, and yet greenness is real, and greenness can exist in multiple places and times and has all sorts of spooky properties that objects don't have. And this is true also of abstract relationship concepts like love and so on and so forth. And again, in the modern scientific era, we're very uncomfortable attributing any kind of absolute final existence to such beings, to things like green or currents. We're much more comfortable saying there are objects that have location in space and time, but then those objects, because of their arrangement, because of their position, because of their interaction, generate these effects. But the problem, of course, is that the effects are what we encounter, and the effects are what we have direct experience of. And so when you start to ask the question, are demons real? That is, are these patterns in our mind real things rather than just phenomena that emerge out of our conscious experience? I think it's useful to replace the word demons with the word gravity. Is gravity real? Is there such a thing as gravity? Now, any scientist will tell you, of course gravity is real. Just try walking out a third-story window and tell me whether gravity is real. There's no wishing gravity away. Gravity is something we all encounter all the time. It's why I'm sitting on this chair and not floating away. But now, ask yourself, what is gravity? Is gravity an object? Well, famously, no. This is the problem with gravity that was already present when Newton was describing the inverse square law, when he was coming up with the mathematics for dealing with gravity. Gottfried Leibniz, his great rival, very notoriously challenged him to say what gravity was. Was it moving through a fluid like an ether that existed in between the planets and in between the objects that attract each other? Because gravity is not a planet. Gravity is not the ball that falls to the ground. It's not the ground or the floor or the planet or anything that attracts through gravity. It's a relationship between all material objects. And if you believe in what would be called the mechanical philosophy, which is that the world is just made of objects that act on each other through contact action, gravity is a big problem. It ends up just being a pattern of behavior. And this is what Newton said about it explicitly. He said, I make no guesses about the occult entities or forces that are acting underneath the surface of gravity. I'm just describing the pattern of behavior that gravity exhibits. And the inverse square law was perfect for this. It was a mathematically exact description up to a certain degree of resolution and size for predicting how objects would behave. And so it was ultimately a relationship and a pattern. And if we want to say that gravity is real, we have to say that relationships and patterns have a certain reality. They have a kind of existence. It's not a physical existence. They're not objects. You can't take a picture of a planet or of a ball that is falling and point and say, there's the gravity in it. And if you could do that, then Leibniz wouldn't have had a problem. But actually, you can't do that. And so the whole history of physics after that, or philosophy of physics, involves trying to puzzle out just what is this thing. And now, of course, we know that it's more than Newton even understood. And Einstein comes along and he says, well, gravity is a feature of space-time. That is, it's part of the relationship between matter and space. And one kind of classic way of describing this is space tells matter how to move, matter tells space how to curve. And this way of thinking about it, and there are mathematical descriptions that come along with it, is also very useful for predicting the phenomena we observe, but it's still not an object, right? It's a relationship or a pattern of interaction between objects, like a kind of current or a set of properties that moves through the universe. It's like almost the warp and weft of the universe, or it's a certain bend in the fabric of things. So if gravity is real, if we wish to say that gravity is real, then we have to say that at least some patterns of behavior, at least certain tendencies that are not themselves physical objects, but can be discerned within the behavior of physical objects, are real, whatever we mean when we say real. If gravity is real, then some patterns, some tendencies are real. And so it's at least possible that a pattern or a tendency in human thought and human experience might have the same kind of reality that gravity has. And so when we say things like, I'm experiencing fear, on the one hand, we're saying something purely about the inner patterns of our lives, the inner way that we're encountering the world and reacting. On the other hand, we're also saying something about the reflexive patterns that tend to shiver and move through us. And when we pathologize them, they say that we have an unnatural or an unhealthy fear response. We're saying that something about that pattern is sort of at odds with the world. There's kind of a jagged mismatch between what we should fear and what we do fear. And this is when we start to think about the possibility that there might be a character to fear that exists everywhere fear is. And every time I have fear and you have fear, that same pattern is sort of flickering through us in the same way that green is not an object that exists anywhere in the world, and yet there is something called green that I see both in the leaves on the trees outside and in the cover of the book that's in front of me. That green has a being, much as gravity has a being, much as fear has a being. And now we start to understand what it might mean to say that there's such a thing as a demon, which is an unhealthy or indeed even hostile pattern or entity that has existence even though it only ever occupies a mind or a soul. And because we've learned to only think in material terms and to identify beings and entities with physical existence, we hear the ancient texts say things like demons exist, and we imagine that they must have meant somewhere there's a little being, a little insectoid kind of thing buzzing around with its tiny wings and its little pitchfork, and it's poking at you. And of course, many medieval manuscripts and works of art do represent demons in this way. But that's because the physical language of art and the physical language of the medieval world is much more comfortable using visual objects as allegories or representations for things like patterns in the mind. Because, in fact, nobody thought there was a little pitchfork-wielding entity. I mean, maybe somebody did, but this was not ever the kind of most sophisticated theory of demons on offer. It's just that in the exact same way that the movie Inside Out takes a little picture of a happy lady with blue hair and yellow skin and says, "This is joy," and nobody involved, not even the 12-year-olds that go, think there's a little being like that running around. Or if they do think that, their parents explain, no, that's not what the movie means. The movie is embodying a certain pattern that we all have within us. And in fact, joy is weirdly fungible because she reappears in every head that we go into in the movie. Every time we go into anybody's head, there's a little joy character. And we might ask the question, is that the same joy as the joy that lives in Riley's head? And is it a variety or a version of the same species? So you're looking here now at basically the same kind of visual language for conveying the idea that things which are not objects and are in fact patterns might have a being unto themselves. And this raises the possibility that some of them might have a being that is not part of the natural structure of our minds. Our minds might have certain currents that are meant to run through them, and other currents that are artificial or that have affected us in some evil way that weren't supposed to be there, that came into us from the outside. Let's say when we observed or were in the presence of some terrible catastrophe, and now need to be cast out and excised. And the concept that another listener shared with me that I think is really useful here, finally, for asking whether these things are real, is a medieval philosophical concept called the ens rationis. And this is a Latin phrase meaning a being of thought. And this is something like gravity that is real, but that unlike gravity exists in the mind. So if gravity is something that exists as a feature of physical terrain that only is within the pattern and the contours of the physical world, and if a current is something that only exists in a fluid, an ens rationis is a current or a pattern or a trend that only exists in the mind, that is to say, the conscious experience that we have of the world. And for medieval philosophers, there are certain things that are true that nevertheless are only what you would call in the plural entia rationis. They are beings of the mind. Certain things like Socrates has a good reputation, right? This is something that is true of Socrates, but doesn't exist anywhere in Socrates. And if there were only Socrates in the world, it wouldn't be true. It's true ultimately as a being of the mind. It exists in us. But it now is a feature of Socrates that is real about him. Or you think about fame, right, in the modern world, celebrity. Celebrity is an ens rationis. There is such a thing as celebrity. Nobody would deny that Lady Gaga is more famous than I am. And yet, I do not have a color or a property or a hairstyle that is called fame. The property of fame or being known that Lady Gaga possesses is something outside of her that is contained in the minds of her various fans. And if each one of those fans disappeared, eventually her fame would reduce and then vanish. And in fact, Lady Gaga has spoken about this in her great wisdom in the song I Live for the Applause. If you know the song I Live for the Applause, it's all about fame. It's all about the experience of being famous. And Lady Gaga has this line, 1 second I'm a Coons fan, suddenly the Coons is me. Coons being a major pop artist. Pop culture was in art, now art's in pop culture in me. I live for the applause, 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 applause. She's saying, I am, in some sense, a creation of fame, and the art that used to be external and exterior has now become part of me because your perception of me, your experience of me, has become a feature of my reality, has become an actual property that I, in some real way, possess. If this is true, and if the outside world is capable of imposing upon us patterns of behavior that, despite not being part of us, nevertheless live in us as real entities, then I slowly begin to lose my memory for why we're not just talking about demons. In other words, the reason this is becoming an Allegregore is because the more I think about it and the more we talk about it, the more the language of demonology seems like a cleaner and simpler language for talking about what therapy, in the form of, for example, internal family systems, is discovering. This is not the only discovery that IFS is making. IFS is also discovering soul parts and the elements of us and the different ways that those interact, but also it's discovering demons. And there's something kind of astonishing, like the story in G.K. Chesterton of the man who sets out for an undiscovered country and then lands on a shore he's never seen before and suddenly realizes he's actually just gone around the world and come back home. But I actually think that that's what's going on with Allegregores and with things like demonology. Because now let's look at what happens to the Gerasene demoniac. I never know how to say that word. Demoniac? Anyway, it's the guy with the demon in Gadarene, or among the Gerasenes. Remember that this is the guy who's sort of withdrawn from society. He's engaging in self-harm, a modern therapist would say. He's dissociated from society and in some sense from himself, because when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." So I want to emphasize again that the first thing that's happened is Jesus has spoken to the spirit within the man as if it were something separate from the man himself. Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "My name is Legion," he replied, "for we are many." And this is a famous line, but one thing we haven't really noticed about it that maybe is now becoming illuminated and clear after this discussion is that the manyness of Legion helps us to understand that this is an entity which is distinct from the man, right? This is a kind of shattered and multifarious creature, being, that might live in multiple different minds at once, just as fear lives in multiple different minds at once. Demons, like certain kinds of currents, like gravity, right, can be in multiple places at once because they ultimately are, what they are is patterns in the mind, right? "My name is Legion, for we are many," and he begged Jesus again not to send them out of the area. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, "Send us among the pigs, allow us to go into them." He gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Now, I don't want to come across here as saying that demonology is just the same thing as what happens in psychotherapy, because that would be, first of all, too simple. It would amount to suggesting that all forms of psychological trouble are demonic possession, which I don't really think is true. I think we can just have wounds and harm within our internal systems, within the soul itself. And yet, it does seem as if we're also capable of incorporating entities into ourselves that don't belong. But the other thing I don't want to say is that, like, demons are perfectly natural, because we can see from this story that there are all sorts of things going on that are uncanny. And like all miracles or supernatural occurrences, they happen a lot in the Gospels, less so in our natural, normal lives. And C.S. Lewis talks in Miracles about the fact that, most of the time the world operates according to its designed logic, because that logic is well constructed. And it's only when something foreign or from outside comes in that we start to need miracles or need things that are supernatural. And so even though Jesus, of course, being a special case, is like doing miracles right and left, dispensing with them all the time, actually the natural way of understanding the world is the way that makes sense most of the time. And I think that's why therapy and psychoanalysis have mostly worked in most contexts for accounting for and describing our experiences of the world, because most of the time we are natural entities. We can be understood as part of a network of cause and effect and so on and so forth. But we are also supernatural entities because we have consciousnesses, because we have this thing in us called the consciousness that is actually above time, that persists through time, that can operate in all these ways that merely physical entities cannot. Therefore, we are also operating on a plane of pattern and tendency and form, which is not bound by space and time and is not bound by matter, is not bound by cause. And that means we are vulnerable to demons. Because demons just are entities that occupy the purely spiritual realm. They occupy the realm of things that are not material, but that can influence or act upon material. And one thing that you'll observe about the way that Jesus deals with the demon is that it's all to do with words. All he does is talk to the demon. He said, he gave permission, he asked, right? These verbs are all about speaking. And language, of course, is our primary tool for identifying, picking out, and selecting within the realm of our experiences the patterns that have existence, that are ens rationis, that are a being of thought. And with words, what we do is we try to shave around the outlines of beings that exist in this spiritual realm. A word as simple as chair, right? Something so commonplace as the word chair is actually a very finely honed tool for cutting out something that is not itself any object. There are many objects that are chairs, but the word chair is a pattern of chairness that is simultaneously present in all chairs everywhere, at all times. Anytime there is a chair, the word chair applies to it. And my word chair is just a verbal representation of the fact that it's my mind that does the shaping. Something in my mind, there's like a group of cookie cutters in my mind, right, that identifies entities like chairs by drawing them out of the series of experiences that I'm always having. And so when I look out at this room that I'm in, there's like three objects that chair template kind of cuts out so that they stand against the background. Same with the word rug, same with the word plant. All these words are vessels for cutting along the lines of the spiritual world. That is the world that is more than merely physical and has to do with patterns, tendencies, things that can be in multiple places at once. The question that I'm raising by talking about the allegregoric nature of some kinds of therapy, such as, for example, internal family systems, is to ask whether words like demon might actually cut closer to the bone of what we mean than words like pathological anxiety, which sometimes end us up casting about for physical solutions where spiritual solutions are needed. We have this division in our brain that says spiritual solutions are things that we use words for. We can talk through spiritual problems. But if you have a physical problem, like, say, an imbalance in your brain chemistry, that's a physical entity that needs physical cures, like drugs, let's say. And I'm not saying that no forms of drugs are helpful there's no such thing as any useful medication in psychotherapy. That would be way too overbroad. But I am saying we have an epidemic of overprescription. And one reason why might be that we have no way of conceptualizing of something that is going on in the mind that is nevertheless an external object to be expelled and worked out. And demons are the most sophisticated, to date, way that we have of talking about that. And if gravity is real, then I think they might be real. Okay, let me know what you think about this, because I am really, trying here to draw new insights out of ancient texts. There's stuff that I'm not totally sure of, concepts that I'm playing with. Obviously, the concept of the Allegregore itself is one that I've just invented and come up with. But even this idea that a demon might be a kind of ens rationis, again, is influenced by medieval theology and by what a lot of you guys are talking to me about. But, I'm very, very curious, I guess, just simply to say, to know what you think. I am going to skip the mailbag this week because this whole show has basically been a mailbag. We've basically been talking about two actually listeners. And so thank you very much to Dan, who wrote in about whether or not anxiety is an Allegregore. And thank you also to the listener whom I've unfortunately forgotten, maybe a YouTube commenter, who talked to me about ens rationis and asked whether this might be relevant as well, because those were both extraordinarily helpful. If you would like to be in the mailbag, which typically is a segment at the end, although sometimes at the beginning, as in this case, of every episode, all you got to do is subscribe to my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You'll get all sorts of goodies, even as a free subscriber. Every week you get a Friday essay where I just sort of reflect on what's been going on in the world and how the Western canon can help us to understand it. I actually wrote a review of Inside Out 1 last week, and you'll get other stuff as well when you sign up. Paid subscribers get a lot of extra stuff. If you would like to support me, that is really wonderful and helps me to run this show without a bunch of ads and all that. So it would be really great. And you then will get a sort of serial audiobook of Paradise Lost. You will get a bunch of live stream Q&As. It's just a variety of other things that paid subscribers get. So you can go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com and either send me a DM or respond to one of my letters that I write on Fridays, and you can ask me various questions in the mailbag that way. All of those links are in the description of this episode. And the last thing I have to tell you about is my typical ending segment, which is called I Maked This, where I tell you about stuff that I've been writing out there in the world that is not part of this podcast, but that I still nevertheless think you might like. I want to take this opportunity to plug a couple books that I have coming out. And one of them is coming out at the end of July. One of them is coming out at the middle of August. The first one is called Gateway to the Epicureans. It's a bunch of translations of Epicurean texts along with a long introduction. One of them is called Light of the Mind, Light of the World, and it's about the history of science and the future of faith. I think you will really enjoy both of these. I'm going to drop the pre-order link in the description of this episode. If you like this show, thank you for being here. It's really just a blast. I have so much fun doing this show. I'm so grateful for all of you for listening. And it would be great to keep growing the audience. So just, if you haven't already, please do drop us a 5-star review. That's the major way. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever, just hit that 5-star button, maybe write a review, because I love reading the reviews as well, and share it on social media, do all that good stuff that lets people know about the show. And as for me, I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.